Well, howdy there, folks. It's James, Political Friar, coming to you again. I got the University of Oregon hat on still, and despite the fact that we just recorded a 25-minute video, we didn't get through even part of the news of the day. And so it's time to move on to the next obvious question, which is now that Joe is dropping out, who's going to replace him? And there's a cast of characters who could fit the bill. The internal Democratic Party politics and reading the tea leaves of that is going to determine where we go with it. But I thought I'd at least do the rundown of the particular folks who could end up emerging from the scrum that has been incited from Joe's departure. Before I do that, though, a moment on process, because when you know the rules of the game, you can commonly determine the outcome of the game before the game is played. And so the rules of this game are not a normal primary. This will not be about voters. This will be about delegates to the Democratic National Convention, set to be held in mid-August. The delegates to the convention vote on who they want the nominees for president and vice president to be, and the first person to get a majority, more 50% plus one of the delegates, becomes the nominee for the party. And normally this is all performative. It's not something that matters all that much because the delegates are bound to the person who won the primary from their state. Well, the person who won the primary from their state, in most of the delegates' cases, there are maybe a couple out there who got picked off by the primary challengers of Biden, but for the most part, they all belong to Joe Biden. Joe Biden has their loyalty. He has the right to call on them to vote for him to be the nominee for president of the United States, except he's not running anymore. So what are these delegates to do? All of them are handpicked by Joe Biden, by the way. These are Joe Biden loyalists. These are people who have an affinity for Joe Biden within the Democratic Party. They would make up Joe Biden's faction within the Democratic Party. Of course, these are also longtime party operatives who have other affiliations too, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and others. And so it's hard to say exactly where these folks' minds are at when you're kind of breaking apart the Democrats into their respective factions. But the one thing that they all are Biden loyalists. And that means the most important thing about these delegates is they're not left-wing progressives, by and large. Some of them are. I mean, inevitably, some of them are. And the portion of the Democratic Party that is populated by left-wing progressives will be underrepresented at this DNC conference because Joe Biden's lane within the Democratic Party isn't the far hard left progressives. That lane is not folks who support Joe Biden. They're folks who will, some portion of them, actively oppose Joe Biden. And so they're really actually not going to be there. And so you are talking about candidates for the Democrats who will be conventional. You're not going to get a shot in the dark, Workers' Party unite, down with systemic whatever, all cops are bastards, that kind of person. They're not going to be a candidate for president from the Democratic Party, not with this slate of delegates. So you do have a centrist slate. So start there with process. You need to have a conventional Democrat. Anybody who is too far out there just isn't going to be on their minds. It won't even occur to this group of people to nominate somebody like AOC or even Bernie Sanders probably couldn't get nominated by this group of delegates. I never mind the fact that he's older than dirt, just like Joe Biden, but that is to say, you're going to need to find a conventional group of Democrats to see which ones are actually going to come out of all of this. And the obvious answer is Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris leads the group. I think her chances of being the nominee for the Democrats are greater than 50%, probably greater than 60%. Everybody else who we're going to talk about in the rest of this video is fighting over the rest of those percentage points as far as chances of emerging at the end. Now, Kamala Harris is not a sure thing. There are folks, and probably very powerful folks in the Democratic Party, who don't want to see Kamala Harris be the nominee. And their reasoning is electoral. It's practical. It's that Kamala Harris's presidential campaign in 2020 imploded, in large part because she's probably a poor manager and a poor campaigner. She had some moments, especially at that debate against Joe Biden, where she caught a bit of fire, but she didn't have the basic competency to follow through on it, and that makes folks worried. It makes folks worried for her ability to get elected. It makes folks worried for her ability to be president. And among those folks who are implicitly worried about Kamala Harris are the ones who just got rid of Joe. Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama have not endorsed Harris as of 7:40 p.m. Pacific time, and that silence is louder than a scream. It is clear that their preference would be to have an open convention out of which someone other than Harris would emerge. They're not really going to get their wish, and they're not really going to get their wish for a simple reason. Kamala Harris is a black female. And in the Democratic Party of 2024, after the leftward lurch that was represented in the COVID times of the Democratic Party culturally, with George Floyd and COVID, you aren't going to pass up somebody with her identity. You can't bump her. The squealing among those very same left-wing progressive activists who aren't represented at the DNC will be overwhelming. And as much as those folks are a minority in the Democratic Party, they're a very loud minority. They are the folks who did the on-campus protests against Israel. They're the folks who broke off from Black Lives Matter movement and decided to break things and set police cars on fire. They're the folks who threw rocks at the federal building here in Oregon for months on end. That group of left-wing cultural progressives will not tolerate somebody of Kamala Harris's identity, black, female, being pushed aside for any reason whatsoever. For those folks, what you are is so much more important than who you are. And the Democratic Party is beholden to them. In the end, they have enough power to veto pushing Kamala Harris aside. And so that's why her chances of getting this nomination are so high. It's not because she's the best candidate. She's very clearly not. She is the right color and gender. And turns out the Democrats really care about color and gender to a degree that is difficult to square with their professed, embrace of equity, inclusion, and diversity. But these types of ideologies can get twisted, especially in the minds of a very vocal minority. Diversity, equity, inclusion is obviously a good idea. The people who unfortunately took over that good idea didn't use it in a good way, and that's why the Republicans are off the hook for a lot of stuff. It's because the Democrats who got real focused on identity kind of scuttled the chances. So this is kind of putting the lead out front, and then I'm going to bury it with a bunch more information about the other people. Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee. Just, you can book it. That said, if Kamala Harris isn't the nominee, the next person that you might see coming out of the Biden administration to be the nominee is Pete Buttigieg. He ran a very competent campaign, in contrast to Harris in 2020. He won Iowa. The guy is clearly very well spoken. He's a nerd enough to be up on the issues, and he's quick enough on his feet to debate Trump and be a good retail politician. The reason why he wouldn't be the nominee is twofold. One, he is 42, and he's a white male. And those are hits against him. I actually think that he's homosexual is probably a positive for him among Democrats, and I don't think it's much of a negative for him among the general electorate. But he's a white male, and he's cisgendered. He behaves like a white male. So the idea of a white male bumping a black female is going to be anathema in this process. But he would be a possible candidate, and you will hear his name later. Because the thing is, if you're in a primary where the votes matter, the power of the entrenched political operatics, like the operatives, wouldn't matter as much. The left-wing progressive identity cultural folks wouldn't have as much power. But when you're dealing with an inter-party fight where the voters aren't going to be consulted, well, these folks are giving their time, energy, and money to a degree that they have to be listened to, even if they aren't politically popular. And so Pete's unfortunately not going to get it. He might be considered if it's an open convention. He might give it a shot, but I think his chances are pretty low. Now the chances of everybody else I'm going to mention next are even lower. The next group of folks that you have who could be the nominee for president, and if there was an open primary where we were going to have voters voting, they would have a pretty good chance. I think they'd beat Harris, frankly, are group of governors. These Democratic governors tend to be in purple states or even in two cases reddish states, and they have done a very good job. They usually are second term governors, or if they're not second term governors, they are coming in with extremely high job approval ratings. And the first one I'm going to mention is J.B. Pritzker. He's the governor of Illinois. He is a billionaire on his own right, so he can self fund all he wants. And he also has been a moderate Republican, not a moderate Democrat. He has taken the centrist lane in Illinois politics and has battled the left. And see, Illinois, like many blue states, the real political divide is between the practical Democrats and the ideological Democrats, and they're both playing against each other. The ideological Democrats pushing for, change, and the practical Democrats saying, "Hey, patience." JD JB Pritzker. See, this is going to go into one of my later points about how none of these people are going to get nominated because their name recognition is so bad that a political junkie like me can't even remember the name off the top of his head. JP Pritzker it would be a good candidate. The next one I'm going to talk about is Andy Beshear. Now, Andy Beshear is probably the most interesting potential presidential candidate among these governors, and that's simply because he comes from Kentucky. Bright red, Southern Kentucky that will go for Donald Trump by 20 points. Even if Beshear becomes the nominee, it's still going to go for Trump by 20 points. He'll lose his home state, even though he is a tremendously popular governor there. His popularity ratings are well north of 50%, and that means a bunch of Republicans approve of him. Now, they're not going to vote for him in a presidential election, but that does say something about his approach. He can connect with the rural white Republican voter that has moved from being a usual Democrat because of the economic incentives to be a Democrat among the rural whites to being a Republican. The idea that a rural white person who is living in a small town would vote Republican and support the type of big business interests that, frankly, use their labor and profit off of it is odd. But that is the oddity of the phenomena of mega culture, and apparently Andy Beshear has figured out a way to thread that needle and retain some of the traditionally Democratic votes out in the rural areas. And so he would be a really interesting candidate. Again, had you heard of Andy Beshear's name before I just said it? Yeah, maybe half of you had. But that is the problem. No name recognition means no chance, especially not with just over 100 days to go. Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan is another candidate that would be interesting. She has weathered the stones and arrows of the Republican opposition in Michigan, which is not insignificant and is very energetic, shall we say, and done a pretty good job. The actual results for Michigan have been fine. I mean, she's ridden the wave of the improving economy after COVID and benefited from that. And she has fairly high approval ratings in her home state. Now, she has said that she will not be running for president. I think that her political calculation is that she would be a better vice president than president at this point in her career, and she's angling for that. And I think she can see the writing on the wall that she won't win anyway, not against Harris. And so she's hoping for a girl power ticket, I think. And it might happen. But we'll have a video about the Veep stakes coming up after a little bit. The next governor that we'll mention is Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom is the governor of California. Oh, and the thing about Whitmer and Newsom both is that their name recognition is so much higher than Pritzker and Beshear. So whereas J.P. Pritzker and Beshear, come from an interesting lane within the Democratic Party that could give them crossover and centrist appeal, or even appeal to rural whites, Whitmer and Newsom are more national names. Their name recognition is significantly higher, and that gives them a better chance in a short type campaign to actually be electable. Gavin Newsom is a chimera. He has not really told us what he intends to do. He did the thing that you would need to do to actually be the nominee, in that he supported Joe Biden to the hilt. If you want to be king, you cannot approve of people going after the king. He was Joe Biden's most ardent supporter, which in my mind is evidence of his interest in replacing Biden even more. If you actually want to be successful as the president, you have to support the president before you. It's just part of the deal. You break down that norm and you're going to have a harder time. And so he did a good job in supporting Joe Biden to the hilt. He has debated Ron DeSantis while Ron DeSantis was a presidential candidate. That gives him some cachet. He was the presidential candidate, yet Ron showed up to the debate. Now, Ron never had a chance of beating Trump, not after maybe last January or maybe even earlier, when it became clear that the Republican Party wasn't going to find Trump unfit, despite his myriad of issues. Let's not make that the topic of this video, the idea that the Republican Party has completely sold its soul. But Gavin, has that advantage, and he also comes from a great, huge state, and he has a gob of money. Unfortunately for him, Harris comes from California too, and she's going to get to go first. Plus, white male. That's a big hit. Don't be a white male and a Democrat. You won't be successful. The final person I want to mention, in this isn't really a likely scenario, but it's Shapiro from Pennsylvania. Shapiro just got elected in Pennsylvania, beating a MAGA Republican in 2022, and he has done a remarkably good job with Pennsylvania. Again, it's easy to be a governor in economic times like these because everybody's boat's rising, and so these guys all have pretty high favorability ratings. But Josh Shapiro will not be the nominee for president in any contest that doesn't involve the voters because he's pro-Israeli. He's a pro-Israeli Jew. And unfortunately, that same group of Democratic activists who will squeal if you bump aside a black female will absolutely lose themselves if you nominated a Jew. That a Jew who's pro-Israeli is absolutely impossible to become the nominee for the Democratic Party, considering the control that particular faction of the Democratic Party, who is more interested in what you are than who you are, is able to put their thumb on the scale. So, sorry, Josh, your religion disqualifies you. Oh, and white male. So, bad times, man. You are not going to be the nominee for this particular Democratic Party. Let's talk about the next group of folks, which I'll kindly call long shots. They are, if Kamala has a 60% chance and these governors are sharing 39% of the rest of that, these next folks are sharing 1% of the rest of it. The first long shot really is populated by people who have run for president before. Thinking about the primary in 2020. So you've got Amy Klobuchar, you've got Cory Booker, you've got Elizabeth Warren, you've got Bernie Sanders. These folks will have trouble for different reasons each, but they're all going to have trouble. Amy Klobuchar and Cory Booker would be good presidential candidates, both of them. They know what they're talking about. They've been in government a long time. They're eminently qualified. They run the centrist lane. They've both had time actually being effective governors. I mean, Cory Booker came from New New Jersey, where he was consistently effective, as has Amy Klobuchar, who comes from the Upper Midwest, an area that needs to be won by the Democrats. If this was an open primary with voters, these guys would have more life. But there has-beens. They had their shot in 2020 and they didn't make it, and they're just not new and shiny enough for your delegates to think that they're cool. And there's other people who occupy the same lane who are more interesting. Buttigieg, for example. I think that the activists who will, be a outsized voice would rather have a gay white man than someone who is straight. I mean, it's just what it is. What you are is really important among Democrats. The next real long shot that I want to talk about. Oh, I guess I should talk about Warren and Sanders. They're too old. If Joe's too old, they're too old. I'm sorry. It's just that easy. All right, the next long shot that I want to talk about is a fun one. It's Hillary Clinton. You better believe that somebody in Hillary land, when they found out that Joe Biden was dropping out, said, "Oh, rematch," and that they would be able to rerun the disastrous 2016 election and maybe set things historically right, the ultimate redemption arc. Thank goodness it appears that Hillary and Bill understand that that's silly. They both came out and endorsed Harris. Um, a draft Hillary movement at the convention would be fascinating. And I wouldn't put it past the Clintons to at least explore it. But they did the thing that they had to do, which was understand that it was Harris's turn, and now they need Harris to implode somehow to be considered. The thing is, they'll be considered after all those other people I just talked about, even if Harris does implode, and she doesn't have a lot of time to implode, and she probably won't. So the idea of a Hillary Clinton rematch with Trump, even though it's super fun, it's not going to happen. The final name that has to be out there, and even if it's just because she's included in so many polls and she does so well, is Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama would be the strongest candidate the Democrats could put up, bar none. She would walk into the White House. And she's not going to run. She doesn't want the job. I don't blame her. I think the job sucks. I mean, I'd do the job because I'm a sicko, but it says something for her general high mental health that she doesn't want to be president of the United States. Good people don't want to be president of the United States. It's just a general rule. So Michelle Obama, absolutely, if the Democrats nominated her and she accepted the nomination, she'd just win. She'd just slaughter Donald Trump, and they're not going to do it, despite her being a black female. And they're not going to do it, not because they don't want to. I think that if she said yes, everybody would say yes too. They're not going to do it because she's not sick in the head. She has no interest in being president. Anyway, that's your rundown about who might succeed Joe Biden coming up in this presidential election in a little more than 100 days. It's going to be interesting to see what the Democrats do with the Ohio issue. That is to say that they need to nominate somebody by August 7th to have them be automatically on the Ohio ballot. It isn't necessary that Democrats do that. Ohio is a pretty red state. It's almost certain to go to Trump anyway, regardless of whether the Democratic nominee is on the ballot. And a lot of these folks have names that are perfectly easy to spell. Writing candidates can do just fine. Ask Lisa Murkowski, not easy to spell, in Alaska. She ran a successful writing campaign. And so in the case where the election is such a blowout that Ohio comes into play, well, the Democrats could win just with a write-in. And so you might see the Democrats just give up on Ohio, just blow that deadline off and go to their in-person convention and have the floor fight, and understanding that they're just not getting on the ballot in Ohio, and oh well. It's going to be interesting to see what they do. They have a meeting of all the delegates scheduled for a virtual nomination vote that was going to nominate President Biden before the Ohio deadline, and it'll be interesting to see if they even hold that. I think that they would be wise not to. I think they would be wise to just go ahead and write off Ohio and do this right over 4 days of floor debate in an open convention in a way that we all know the American political parties have nominated their candidates traditionally. From the founding until the 1960s, the convention was where the action was on a nomination, not the primaries. Kennedy's use of the primaries, because the primaries were all advisory before then. There was no such thing as a bound delegate. You would just have delegates that would get selected by that candidate, but they weren't bound to vote for Kennedy, even if Kennedy selected them. Well, Kennedy broke the mold, and he actually campaigned in the primaries with the idea that if he selected the candidates, they would be more likely to vote for him. And it turns out it worked. And then the laws came along and reinforced this idea that the candidates, the delegates to the convention, should be bound. And then we got our modern primary system. But this is modern. This is new. This is different. The American political system can handle an open convention. And it's kind of fun because I'm going to get to see one in my lifetime. I appreciate that. All right, well, leave me a like, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Leave a comment. Everything you do that interacts with this video helps other people find it. So if you had a good time with it, give me a little support. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.